Hello everybody, welcome back to ComedIan MTG. My name is Ian. This week we are breaking down the top 4 from Punt City. I was at this tournament, I made it to the semifinals, and I'm going to break down everything about this tournament, all my experiences from it, talk about all the super cool things in it, and go from there. So Punt City, first tournament put on by Eminence Gaming. It was, in my opinion, a giant success. It was an awesome time. I was super happy to be there. The organizational team that ran it was really solid. It was a Swiss semi-random tournament. There's a really interesting conversation going on with that, basically how that broke down. But basically people were posted or the rounds were with people who had very similar schedules, like a normal Swiss. But there were a few like key differences. It was a 6-round tournament, which seems to be what people are starting to push towards as the norm, which is pretty interesting. I tend to like those more because there's a lot less chance that people just kind of stumble into a few victories here and there, as opposed to like a 6-round tournament, which, you know, you really have to have a consistent record. Like people who were 3-3, some of them didn't qualify. So only people with the best breakers at 3-3 didn't qualify. And a 50% win rate for that to not to qualify for the top tables in a multiplayer tournament where your win rate's supposed to be like 25%. So it's like it's pretty interesting in that sense. So people who were like 3-2-1, like I was during the Swiss, qualified. We had one person, Ara or Alana, was completely undefeated on Blue Farm during the Swiss, so there's a lot that happened in this tournament. But today we're here breaking down this top 4, and I'm so excited to show you these insane decks. First one here, and not really that much of a surprise, we have a Blue Farm deck making it all the way to the final table. And the undefeated player that I mentioned before, Ara, was actually also undefeated during the Swiss playing Blue Farm. They were also in my semifinals match, but we lost out to a player that I will talk about a little later. This mid-range Blue Farm list is nothing too insane, running some pieces that aren't considered like standard, I would say, for Blue Farm, cards like Douthie Voidwalker and Bergie, although they're pieces that have very much been played. Dranith definitely is an include that I'm a fan of because the card is just such an insane one-sided stacks piece. It still can draw you cards off of Tymna. The 1/3 body means that it doesn't really have awkward combat situations happen with it too much, and obviously it's just an insanely powerful card, so that's pretty cool and not often seen in Blue Farm lists. Grim Tutor is another card that I've been pushing for more and more lately. It's just a solid tutor, and it's awkward because 1 black is not a cheap cost, and you do lose 3 life, but honestly, I think your deck is always going to be better than your opponent's decks at what you're trying to do. So for me, Grim Tutor is just often much better than something like a Praetor's Grasp and praying your opponents have the right answers, especially when the meta is super diverse. If you'll notice, there are Windfall and Wheel of Fortune, no Time Twister here, so that's pretty interesting, something I've also been harping on for people to play for a bit now, just sort of moving away from Time Twister when your graveyard cares about things in the graveyard. So things like Mnemonic Betrayal for your opponent's graveyards, or obviously you're playing Underworld Breach for your own graveyards. One thing that I think this list probably did well that I think not every single list was doing was playing Toxic Deluge and playing Dress Down. The Punt City meta was sort of predicted to be a more aggressive meta, but in classic cEDH tournament fashion, it ended up being just a meta full of really powerful cards, but also diverse strategies, because that's kind of what cEDH is. People bring the decks that they know. People bring the decks that they like to play. There were stacks decks, there were mid-range decks, there was a variety of different options. I mean, if you look at the top 16 for this tournament, there's things like Winota, the Rocco, Yenet. I mean, there's some crazy stuff in the top 16 of this tournament, which I will link down below in the show notes. So make sure to check that out, because for what was sort of projected for this tournament, the meta was just way more diverse. And I think that's really showing kind of what cEDH is and continues to evolve to be in this tournament space, a place in which, yes, there are some decks that tend to be in the top 20%, top 25% of performances, but every time people are pushing the envelope and playing new and unique and different things, it's gonna challenge the preconceptions of what we know. So people who play in these insular metas that like see a lot of the same stuff over and over again, they really aren't experiencing what a normal cEDH tournament will be, which is super diverse, basically. One include that I really like in these versions of Blue Farm is the inclusion of City of Traders. Now, obviously this land has a major downside. If your opponent plays another land, it gets sacrificed, but really taking advantage of that with the amount of 2-mana talismans here with Arcane Signet, Fellwar Stone, Talisman of Progress, Talisman of Dominance, and Talisman of Creativity. I think that classic like Ancient Tomb into Mana Rock curve, being able to basically double up the potential of doing that definitely adds a lot more consistency to the list, and I really enjoy their use of that here, and especially when you have a commander like Crom, right, which, I mean, it does have 3 colorless as a demand for it. It's good to be able to push that card out even faster, and with this sort of 2-mana land into Talisman, you really can do that. Obviously, a card like City of Traders creates a lot more explosive turn 2s, but then obviously the grinding later, you're sacrificing a land to be able to continue to push value out. But this strategy is one that doesn't really like need to have a ton of lands in the battlefield, and you're trying to, you know, push your advantage in the early game anyway, so it's kind of how it is. But as you can see, kind of with some of these creature inclusions, cards like Draenith and Duthie, Blue Farm isn't just a turbo deck, right? It is a mid-range deck that happens to have a more aggressive slant to it. And because of that, there's certain ways you have to construct the deck that are more indicative of that slant, right? And I think we're seeing a lot of inclusions here, especially cards like Cyclonograph Swords. Like, not always do you see Blue Farm lists included this many interaction pieces, but this is a solid amount of interaction in this Blue Farm list. Congrats to Rocket Man for this performance. Someone who is sort of, I don't know too personally, but I know is in the same sort of circles I float around in. So congrats to them, and moving on to the next one. Now, this is super cool for me personally. I got to experience a game with this player in the Swiss. This was a really cool player, Necrowind, playing Urza, and what's different about this Urza list and why this is really cool for me is because this is Creature Urza, specifically playing the Reality Chip. Now, for those who have been watching my channel for a bit, they know that during the Kamigawa set review, I went on a whole diatribe about how the Reality Chip had the potential to revolutionize Urza. And when I was talking to this player after the rounds, that was like exactly what they were saying. And it felt so cool to have this affirmed by someone who is like one of the big Urza players and someone who plays this strategy a lot. And obviously making it to the top 4 of this tournament. I mean, I think they ended the Swiss in 2nd place, and you know, obviously made it to the top 4, was basically 1 card away from winning the entire tournament when our winning deck, which I'll talk about in a minute, ended up taking the game. But super solid performance from this Urza deck, the Reality Chip being a major player in this list, and it's so cool to see Urza doing well again, because it was kind of a deck that I'd started to give up on a little bit. And for those who've watched my monocolored video list here, you'll hear my ramblings on it, but being able to change sort of the function of this deck and move on from kind of the more outdated ways of thinking about it, or at least ways of thinking about it that have been very much the same, which is you have to play the Polytyrant version. I'm really glad we're moving away from that and into this new version, and obviously the result it put up is fantastic, so love to see that here. Bellsky is a card I've loved in Urza for a really long time, but once again haven't been able to play it as creature. It's super cool to see him Malevolent Hermit, because so many cards in this deck are non-creatures. The Planeswalker Suite's really nice here, because unlike in the Polytyrant Urza list, usually you don't have things to protect them, but these sort of get immediate value. I watched this player absolutely use Tezzeret to crush several games. I did actually play against them in the Swiss, and absolutely lost to the most insane start I've ever seen in a game, in which that player went turn 1, Island, Soul Ring, Grim Monolith, Trinisphere, and the rest of us kind of looked at our hands and we're like, oh, okay, we're done. But yeah, it was a pretty insane start to that game. Obviously, that was not what happened every single match, right? This player obviously earned their spot by performing extremely, extremely well during the Swiss, but that was just a fun little story for that moment. It was it was definitely a game. Nothing too crazy here in the Sorcery Suite, just kind of standard Urza stuff. Urza's still opting to play a lot of wheels. Having Narset obviously helps break parity on that with, you know, other decks in the format. One super solid benefit of being able to play the creature version of Urza is that you get to play Grafdigger's Cage. Grafdigger's Cage obviously being an artifact that works with Urza, and normally with a Polytyrant build, you're flipping a creature out of your library, so you can't play that. But having Grafdigger's Cage, being able to have that against decks like Winota, against graveyard decks, against a ton of different strategies, I think that's one of the other main benefits of playing this variant of Urza, which is you get to have this card specifically because it's just so strong. And then the main win conditions of the deck: Power Artifact plus Grim Monolith, obviously making you infinite mana, Isochron Scepter loops with Dramatic Reversal, classic infinite mana Urza stuff, or then the Hullbreaker Horror loops where you're bouncing a bunch of stuff and whatnot. But it's pretty solid. I mean, the list just performed really, really well. I asked, sort of what was the MVP of this deck, because I had a feeling after we played in the Swiss that this was a deck I was going to see in the top 4. We actually had talked about, what this player could do to get this featured. And I said, well, just make the finals. And here we are, right? So the reality chip, from what I heard, plus that in combination with Counterbalance, apparently was like the Hail Mary of this list. Just the ability to be able to play out the top of your library, be able to reset it with Urza and cast a bunch of spells, because like mana's never the problem with Urza. So if you have the reality chip, which is already generating you a ton of advantage, basically being your future sight, and you have Counterbalance online, it's absolutely an insane value engine. So that's, from what I heard, a big part of the success of the deck was being able to have that engine to be able to conquer the mid-range decks, and then have the other tools that Urza has access to, being the orbs, Trinisphere, all that stuff, to really be able to finish out those games. So huge congrats on this list. So excited to see Urza finally do well after a long period of sort of quiet, and really exciting to see this list perform. And a huge shout out to Necrowind. They were super kind. A lot of people went out of their way to mention how kind this player was, and just great to talk to throughout the whole tournament. So super cool stuff. And now the list of the player that knocked me out of the semifinals. And those who have been watching my channel for some time may realize that this is the second time this has happened, because I was playing Winota again after Marquesa. I was playing Winota in this tournament, and just like in Marquesa, played Winota in the semifinals, ended up in a 1v1 match because the other 2 opponents had died, and basically 1 or 2 pivoting moves sent this match into their hands. Probably one of my favorite games I played in a long time. It was absolutely fantastic, and I would not rather have lost to another person. This is such a cool deck. This is mono white mid-range Nas by Evaldi, Charles, the mono white guy. Basically my cEDH rival at this point, because Charles keeps absolutely pulling out these last minute things in these really brilliantly played games. And it's so beautifully frustrating to have someone who I know and am friends with and respect just keep pulling it out in the last minute. I'll see if I can maybe find a clip from that Twitch stream. But we had the feature match. It came down to basically 1 or 2 cards flipped off the top of the library, some little bit of politicking here and there. But it was such an amazing semifinals match. And I left it not feeling like I had been robbed in any way, but genuinely feeling like here was a match in which several really smart players were able to just give it 100% and just perform at the optimal way. Yeah, it was fantastic magic, and I really advise anyone who can go check out that Eminence stream to really do so, because it was such a good match, and I wouldn't have had it any other way. But let's talk about this. Well, I guess I would have had it one other way, which is me winning in the end, but let's talk about this deck. So this is Ao, the Dawn Sky. For those who don't know, Ao's kind of value engine involves either it dying and you putting 1/1 counters on either permanents you control that are creatures or vehicles, or you can look at the top 7 and put total mana cost 4 or less permanents onto the battlefield, and then Ao goes back to the command zone usually. What does Ao do? So Ao used to be more of a combo deck where you would sacrifice it with cards like Phyrexian Altar, Ashnod's Altar, and then Nim Deathmantle it. And you may hear me saying used to and be like, but Ian, these cards are right in front of you. Yes, they definitely are, and they definitely are engines in the deck. But Charles kind of went through this whole revamping of this list because it wasn't quite performing the way he wanted it to, and it was having inconsistencies that he wasn't a big fan of, and kind of made it this mono white mid-range deck, as he calls it. But now he's playing cards like Out of Time, which was the absolutely backbreaking card I lost to in the semis. And he's playing cards like Tragic Arrogance that just basically let him completely wipe his opponent's boards and choose the permanents they have left. Has Cadmir Rector Line, so it's a lot less focused on specifically going really, really hard into the Owl combo and more focused on these sort of mono white mid-range value plans, like cards like Esper Sentinel, having still beat sticks like Sarah Ascendant, but still keeping stacks pieces like the rule of all effects like Dranith and Ether Sworn, Archon of Emeria, Aven Mind Sensor, Spirit of Labyrinth, Sanctifier, right? So it still has stacks pieces, but it's kind of weird to call it a stacks deck, because that's not really what the deck is doing, right? You don't see a bunch of things like Null Rod or Stony Silence. This is much more of a mono white mid-range deck, right? It has value engines, it has things that really allow it to break value on what people are doing in the format right now, and that's kind of what it's trying to do. So it's a super unique deck, definitely very strange. And for those who don't know, like, the actual combo part of it, when I mentioned the altars earlier, it's basically the altars plus Nim Death Mantle allow you to, so you can sacrifice Ow to make 2 colorless mana. Astronaut's also the easiest one to combo off with. So you have 2 colorless mana floating, and then you get to look at your top 4 and you put 4 mana worth of permanence onto the battlefield. The idea there is that most of the time you will hit a creature as part of that top 4. And when you hit a creature, obviously the creature is then able to be sacrificed for 2 mana and keep going. So then anything that you did hit that wasn't one single creature allows you to continue the loop and get free value. And then you eventually get going to the point where you've sort of now flipped over a bunch of really low CMC stuff, which is the reference to Adnaz in the title of this deck, because you're flipping over these very, very low CMC permanents, right? Like, look at all these 1s and 2s here. So every time you're flipping something over, you're adding more value to the board, and then suddenly you start accruing value over and over again. You can eventually get it to the point where, I know originally the main win condition was Relic File, which says as long as you control a cleric, it has whenever a creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain a life. So now suddenly when you're actually going through this loop, you're like pinging your opponents to death and stuff like that. In addition, it gets easier whenever you can get an Enduring Renewal onto the battlefield, because that says the back part of that is the important part, which says whenever creatures put into your graveyard from play, return to your hand. So then you kind of get that whole loop going. But as I said, the fact that, like, when Ow dies, it can also put 2/1/1 counters on each creature you control means that you're also just, like, sometimes sacrificing this creature or using its ability to just buff your entire board. And another thing not to be overlooked about this deck is the commander is a 5/4 flyer with vigilance, which may be like the best line of combat text ever on a just like on a commander that already does some stuff. Because for commander specifically, a big body, so 5/4 stops a lot of stuff. It definitely blocks Tymna, right? Like the age-old meme. It puts up with a lot of things, like even in Winota, which is usually a deck that has a bunch of cards that go over the top of it. I found that having that 5/4 stare me down meant I couldn't do a lot of optimal attacks into this list. Flying, huge. Now you're getting around other board states and you're putting pressure on your opponents, and it has vigilance, which means it's not like it has to attack and commit to being on the offense. It has vigilance, so it can attack and still stay back to block with that terrifyingly large body that I mentioned earlier. So Ow is actually pretty solid in the command zone. This is, you know, another classic Charles performance, just doing the mono white thing. And that's not to take away from this accomplishment, because to play a list that isn't his Heliod list and to have another result like this is obviously extremely impressive. And with a list that I've been a big fan of for a while, because I thought Ow was really, really cool. And I'm glad to see this revamp of it performing extremely well, which it definitely did during the game. There were definitely times in which the deck could have fizzled. There was a situation where, like, if Charles didn't get a Wishclaw Talisman from our blue farm opponent, he probably would have just started running out of gas and things to do, but that wasn't the case, and he got that Wishclaw, and it completely changed the course of the game, and, you know, stuff like that. So Ow is not a perfect engine by any means, but it performed really well, and it was a super solid deck. And unless I'm mistaken, and I wasn't sure if Charles was memeing when he said this, but I'm pretty sure he did get inspired to play this list specifically as a reaction to my breaking down the best monocolored decks videos. Charles, if you're seeing this, comment down below with your entire reasoning, because I don't want to misquote you here, but I know it had something to do with that, which is really funny. Mad respect for Charles. He's someone who I get along with very well, and a player who constantly makes me respect his choices during the game. Is someone who's very intelligent and someone who I really enjoy playing with, because there are very few players who constantly make me feel like playing with them is always improving my game, and he is one of them for sure. And I'm so happy about this next inclusion, because this is someone who I've been talking to for so long and who I've been hyping up for a while and who I've been working with forever. This is Mike Sad Robot from Playing with Power. someone who we like talk about our love for Winota so often. We talk about how much we enjoy this deck, and Mike and I like just got along so well pretty early on because of the fact that we both bonded over loving this deck. And it's just so hyped to see him take down this whole tournament with it. The fact that the two of us were, I know we both ended the Swiss within the top 10 players of this entire tournament. So the fact that there were two top 10 Winota lists, and we had another player who also went 3-3 with Winota but had worse breakers, so they didn't get in. So, all of these Winota performances were freaking awesome. And then, of course, to have it be Mike, just who's someone who I have enjoyed for so long, an awesome person, and someone who loves this deck so much, and also someone who signed up for this tournament 10 minutes before the deck inclusion sign off. Mike was just going with friends and was just like, yeah, sure, I'll play in this tournament. In 10 minutes before the signups were cut off, he decided to join, and he wins the whole thing, which is so cool. Yeah, it's so exciting to see this. But anyways, let's talk about this. This is Mike's top 4 Winota Turbo Stacks list. It is very similar to my primer. There are only a few cards different. So using the compare feature here on Moxfield, we're 3 cards off. So where my primer list plays Skirk Prospector, Cliffside Rescuer, and Inkmoth Nexus, Mike is on Urza Saga, so 1 for 1 right there with the land. Cliffside Rescuer for Braid, and Rush Phalanx for Skirk Prospector. I didn't love Phalanx when I was playing it, but Mike's kept it in for quite some time. And then a Braid, obviously removal's removal, so having that's pretty solid. But in general, they're pretty similar to my list, and it's just so cool to see this list perform so well once again, and just in the hands of someone so deserving. I am so proud of Mike for doing well with this list. And also, if you ever get a chance to see any of the footage of Mike playing this list, the man has it blinged out to all it. Like, it is gorgeous. He has an awesomely beautiful Winota deck with a super cool altar of Winota that he uses all the time. But Mike played so amazingly with the deck. His lines were so tight. He's been playing the deck as like his main list for like a really long time, and I love seeing people I know play this deck and do really well with it, and it's so cool. Winota's a real deck for sure, and Ken Bauman was just tweeting out that it now is tied with Clark Sakashima for the second most wins of any cEDH archetype. So I think it was Najila has the most right now by like a decent amount, and then in second, tied for second, is Clark Sakashima and Winota. And I think that just speaks volumes. These are lists that I have talked about as very strong tournament contenders for quite some time. And here's just another result in the fact that there were multiple pilots in this tournament who all could have made top 16. 2 of us did. 3 of us could have. It's really crazy. And I'm just so proud that this list has evolved into something like this. I was talking to somebody the other day, and I tweeted out that it's got 140,000 views on Moxfield. So Winota being such a popular list, and a list that not only is popular and unique for a deck that people thought Boros wasn't even playable, now it's one of the most highly performing tournament decks in cEDH. So it's just such a wild turnaround. And once again, I'm just so proud to see a friend of mine take down the entire tournament, take down a huge tournament. This is the largest tournament since Marchesa. There were 120 players in this tournament. So this was no sneeze. Like, this was a real tournament. To be at an insane winning record, I think if you do the math, he was like 6-2-1 for the entire tournament. So once again, these larger tournaments with these more rounds in the Swiss, and then cut to top 16, then cut to top 4. They're super indicative of what decks are going to perform well in a larger setting. So Winota taking down the whole thing is just awesome. I think the deck is just in a really solid place right now. I made some swaps to my version that I can post the version that I played, and it's probably going to be reflected in the primer pretty soon. But yeah, it's super awesome to see Mike do well with this list. For those who don't know it that well, basically Winota says you can generate a ton of free value. It's free value in the command zone. Whenever a non-human creature attacks, you look at the top 6, put a human in, tapped and attacking, and it's indestructible. The value from this card is just absolutely wild. I've noticed a lot of the pilots that know the deck really well are learning how to play it without Winota. So for a while, people were basically struggling with the deck and being like, oh, how do I stop it losing to a lot of interaction? So pilots that are really comfortable with the list are learning how to have hands that have Giver of Runes or Alseid, or cards like Grand Abolisher, things that are able to either accelerate your game plan in a way that like you're either doing like an insane turn 1 enabler, things like you're either doing turn 1 Legion Warboss into turn 2 Winota, or you're making these smarter plays by going for things like Giver of Runes, Mother of Runes, protecting your wins and protecting Winota as she comes down. And this was a debate actually today in the Winota server, or not even a debate, but something that got brought up, which is the fact that this is one of the advantage the Kiki list has, which is that the Kiki list has the ability to rely on Winota herself less. We still have all the advantages of being able to just do the turbo Winota thing and like turn her sideways and like go for it. But my top 16 match, I was locked under Dranith for several turns and I still almost won the game, and they had to deluge my board because I had Kiki out with a Thalia's Lancers, and I was able to basically present 8 damage every turn while also being able to tutor up my legendary permanents and put them into my hand and present like a ton of damage onto the board state. So, you know, just something to mention about the Kiki variant. Like, Kiki has been extremely consistent. Mike is a diehard Kiki fan, and we kind of bonded about that multiple times, about how we're both really solid on the Kiki lines. As I said, it's just so cool to see Mike do well with this list, to win the whole thing with Winota and to take down a major tournament, something he wasn't even going to participate in 10 minutes beforehand. It's just so cool. Major congratulations to Mike for winning this whole tournament. Major congratulations to all of our top 4. 2 of our top 4 bringing 2 monocolored decks that traditionally have not been looked upon highly, or at least for Urza in current modern senses has started to lose a lot of steam. And now 2 players have put in the hustle and had this awesome performance at a very large tournament. Eminence put on a fantastic tournament. They have another event coming up soon that I will hopefully do a little bit of promo for. They have another Punt City, and specifically a Philly-based tournament happening next year. It's already been announced. There's huge things on the way as far as Eminence is concerned, so keep looking out for this tournament group. As long as they keep up the condition like this, I'm going to keep hyping them up because they did a really fantastic job with this tournament. I love seeing these larger scale cEDH tournaments, and it was an awesome time. Thank you everybody for joining me here today. I am so excited to be able to bring you these videos. If you like videos like this, please hit like and subscribe. It lets YouTube know that you enjoy these, and make sure to check out patreon.com/ComedIanMTG. You can get your name in the show notes at the end of the show, and you can help support my ability to be able to go and compete in these tournaments and give you real live reactions from the field, to be able to tell you exactly what's happening in these tournaments and give you the most up-to-date meta breakdowns and tournament breakdowns as possible. And all of that's because of the patrons. So thank you so much. Your support lets this channel continue to be what it is and to grow and to gain new identity. And it helps to make this something I can do consistently. I would not be able to do this without the help of people over at Patreon. So if you're ever considering coming in for support, patreon.com/ComedIanMTG. Thank you all so much for joining me. Have an amazing week. Catch you next time. Peace.
I can feel the blood creeping up from the heathens. Got will, got fight, got pride, got reason. If they wanna go eat, then you know I'm gon' feed them. If you're coming for me, hope you're ready for a demon. I got eyes in the back of my head, I'm seeing